It is a calculated, filtered glow that hits the mahogany floors of our penthouse with a precision that feels almost surgical. I sat there, my fingers tracing the cold, condensation-slicked rim of a crystal glass, watching the way the dust motes danced in the silence. It was the kind of silence that had a weight to it, a pressure that pushed against my eardrums until I could hear the frantic thudding of my own heart. Julian was in the other room, the soft, rhythmic sound of his packing, the zipping of leather, the rustle of starch-white shirts, acting as a metronome for my impending breakdown. He told me it was Seattle. A big infrastructure project, he had said. Something about a sustainable high-rise that would redefine the skyline. He looked me straight in the eyes when he said it, his gaze steady, his voice devoid of even a flicker of hesitation. That was the Julian Thorne I had built. I had taken a man with nothing but a degree and a hunger in his eyes and turned him into the architect of the century, using my father's name and my family's old, weathered gold. The envelope was still sitting on the marble island in the kitchen, tucked under a pile of glossy architectural digests. It was a mistake, a tiny, bureaucratic slip-up that would eventually burn my world to ash. It was a homeowner's insurance policy for a property I didn't recognize. The address wasn't in Seattle. It wasn't even in New York. It was Malibu. The Azure Shell, the document called it. A $5 million estate sitting on the edge of the Pacific, listed under a holding company that I knew, with a sickening certainty, was tied to our private trust. My trust. The money my grandfather had set aside for the Vanderbilt legacy. I remember how the paper felt between my fingers, crisp, official, and cold. So cold. I had stood there for 20 minutes, the smell of the expensive Blue Mountain coffee. Julian loved so much, filling the air, feeling like I was disappearing. I felt like a ghost haunting my own kitchen. Julian walked in then, smelling of sandalwood and success. He looked perfect, as he always did, his navy suit tailored to perfection, hiding the heart of a man I realized I didn't know at all. He didn't see the envelope. He only saw the back of my head, the stillness of my posture. He wrapped his arms around me, his breath warm against my neck, and for a second, I wanted to lean back. I wanted to believe the lie because the truth was a jagged glass wall I wasn't ready to walk through. He whispered that he would miss me. He whispered that 3 months was too long to be apart, but that the Seattle project would secure our future for the next decade. Our future. The word felt like a slur. I stayed silent, my eyes fixed on a small crack in the marble that I had never noticed before. How many other cracks were there? How much of our marriage was just a facade held together by my silence and his practiced charm? He left at noon. The sound of the heavy oak door clicking shut felt like a gunshot in the cavernous apartment. I didn't move for a long time. I just listened to the elevator hum, taking him down to the street where a black town car was waiting to whisk him away to JFK. Or so I was supposed to think. I knew he wasn't going to New York's airport. He was likely heading to a private terminal, perhaps Teterboro, where the rules were different and the eyes were fewer. I walked over to his study, my bare feet silent on the silk rugs. The room still smelled of him. The old books, the expensive scotch, the scent of a man who belonged. I sat in his leather chair, the one I had bought him for our 5th anniversary, and felt the immense, suffocating irony of it all. I opened his secondary laptop, the one he thought I never touched. I knew the password. It was our wedding date. It was a knife to the ribs to realize he used the day he vowed to honor me as a key to the vault of his betrayals. The iCloud sync was the final nail. Men like Julian are brilliant at the big picture, but often overlook the digital tether that binds their devices together. I opened the photo stream and my breath hitched. There were photos from this morning, taken just an hour before he hugged me goodbye. He wasn't in a suit. He was in a linen shirt, relaxed, smiling into the camera with a warmth I hadn't seen in years. And there was Eleanor Vance, my former assistant, the girl I had hired because she seemed so eager, so bright, so harmless. She was standing in a sun-drenched kitchen, her hand resting on a prominent, rounded belly. She looked radiant. She looked like she owned the sunlight. There was a folder titled Our Little Angel. I clicked it, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped the mouse. Inside were ecograms. 12 weeks. 20 weeks. 28 weeks. Under each one, Julian had written notes. Daddy's little architect. Can't wait to meet you, Leo. I felt a visceral, physical pain in my stomach, a cramping so intense I had to double over. We had tried for years. I had endured the needles, the hormones, the clinical coldness of the fertility clinics, the silent car rides home after every failed cycle. He had held my hand and told me it didn't matter, that I was enough. But while I was mourning the children we never had, he was planting a garden in someone else's soil. He had been building a secret life for nearly a year, right under my nose, using my resources to fund a sanctuary for his mistress and his bastard son. I scrolled further down. There were photos of the Malibu house, the azure shell. It was beautiful in a way that hurt to look at. Floor-to-ceiling glass, white sand, the endless blue of the Pacific. It was a masterpiece of architecture, likely designed by Julian himself, a love letter in glass and stone to a woman who wasn't his wife. I saw photos of them on the deck. Eleanor wrapped in a cashmere throw, Julian holding a bottle of champagne. They looked like a family. They looked like the reality I had prayed for every night for a decade. I realized then that I wasn't just a wife who had been cheated on. I was a financier who had been robbed. He hadn't just taken his heart elsewhere. He had systematically siphoned off millions from the Vanderbilt accounts to build this alternate universe. He had treated my family's legacy like a personal ATM for his infidelity. How did I not see it? The late nights at the office that weren't about blueprints. The weekend site visits that always seemed to coincide with Elena's time off. The subtle coldness that had crept into our bed like a winter fog. I had blamed myself. I had blamed the stress of the business, the disappointment of the infertility, the weight of my own expectations. I had tried harder. I had bought more expensive lingerie, planned more elaborate vacations, supported every one of his professional whims. I had been the perfect New York socialite, the perfect business partner, the perfect anchor. And all the while, he was waiting for the right moment to cut the rope and let me drift into the abyss. I walked to the window and looked out at the New York skyline. The city looked grey, indifferent, a concrete jungle built on the bones of people who had been betrayed before me. I thought about the phone call he made right before he left. I had overheard a snippet of it. He was talking to his lawyer, or who I thought was his lawyer. He said, "Harrison, keep it quiet. My wife shouldn't know a thing." He thought he was so clever. He thought I was still the fragile, mourning woman who couldn't handle the truth. He didn't know that the Vanderbilt blood in my veins wasn't just blue. It was cold. It was the blood of men who built empires by knowing exactly when to strike. I picked up my phone. My thumb hovered over the contact for Harrison Sterling. Harrison had been my father's legal counsel for 40 years. He knew where every body was buried, every cent was hidden, and every secret was kept. He was more than a lawyer. He was the architect of our family's protection. I dialed the number. The ringing sound was the only thing in the room. When he answered, his voice was like aged whiskey, smooth, deep, and utterly reliable. He didn't ask how I was. He knew me well enough to hear the change in my breathing. "Harrison," I said, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else, someone much older and much more dangerous. "I need you to listen very carefully. Julian is on his way to Malibu. He thinks he's starting a new life at a place called the Azure Shell. He thinks he's spent my money to buy a throne for his mistress. I want everything stopped. I want the accounts frozen. I want the deed to that house pulled into a legal vacuum. And Harrison—" I paused, a single cold tear finally escaping and rolling down my cheek. "I want him to find out from you. Not today. Not tomorrow. I want him to get settled. I want him to feel safe. I want him to believe he has won. And then I want you to pull the floor out from under his feet." There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could hear Harrison's pen scratching against a notepad. "Understood, Victoria," he said softly. "I'll begin the paperwork immediately. Is there anything else?" I looked at the photos of the baby on the screen, the little boy named Leo, who looked so much like Julian it made my throat ache. "No," I whispered. "Just tell the staff to prepare the car. I'm going to my father's estate in the Hamptons. I need to be among things that are old and permanent. I need to remember who I was before I became Julian Thorne's wife." I hung up and stood there in the middle of the study, the sun slowly shifting across the room. The pain was still there, a dull, throbbing ache in the center of my chest, but it was being slowly encased in a layer of ice. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to throw his expensive scotch against the wall or tear his tailored suits to shreds. That would be too easy. That would be what he expected from a woman in my position. No, I was going to be the silent architect of his ruin. He wanted a villa by the sea. I would make sure it became his prison. He wanted a legacy with another woman. I would make sure he didn't have a cent to leave him. I walked back to our bedroom, the room where we had whispered secrets and made plans that were all lies. I looked at the unmade bed, the indentation on his side of the mattress still visible. It felt like a crime scene. I grabbed my vintage leather suitcase and began to pack. Not everything, just the essentials. My jewelry, my legal documents, the few things that truly belonged to me. I left the expensive gowns he had bought me, the shoes, the handbags. They were all tokens of my entrapment. As I walked out of the apartment, I didn't look back. The silence was no longer heavy. It was a weapon. I was Victoria Vanderbilt again, and for the first time in 10 years, I realized that I didn't need a man to build a life. I was the one who owned the land, the money, and the power. Julian Thorne was just a tenant, and his lease had just been cancelled. The drive to the Hamptons was long and lonely. The grey Atlantic loomed to my right, the waves crashing against the shore with a mindless, repetitive violence. I thought about the first time I took Julian to the estate. He was so impressed, so eager to please my father. He looked at the vast gardens and the sprawling mansion, and I saw the hunger in him. I thought it was ambition for us. I didn't realize it was a blueprint for my replacement. I arrived at the gates as the sun was setting, the long shadows of the oaks stretching across the driveway like skeletal fingers. This was my fortress. This was where the Vanderbilts retreated when the world became too loud or too treacherous. I stepped out of the car and felt the salt air hit my face. It was cold, biting, and honest. I walked up the stone steps, my heels clicking against the granite, and felt the ghosts of my ancestors welcoming me home. They knew about betrayal, who knew about the cost of power. I walked into the grand foyer, the portraits of my father and grandfather staring down at me with their unyielding eyes. I wasn't the broken wife they had seen at the funeral of my pride. I was their daughter. I sat down at the mahogany desk in the library and opened my laptop. I had a lot of work to do. Part 1 of Julian's life was over. Part 2 was about to begin, and I was the one holding the pen. The journey through the wreckage of a shattered heart is a solitary one, marked by the realization that the people we love most are often the ones we know the least. In the wake of such a profound betrayal, it is easy to succumb to the darkness of despair, but it is in these very depths that we find the steel within our souls. I had to learn that my worth was never tied to his loyalty, and that the legacy of my family was a shield, not a burden. Healing is not the absence of the scar, but the strength to carry it as a badge of survival, finding light in the quiet resolution to reclaim my own story and emerge from the trauma not just restored, but transformed. The ink was black, thick, and permanent, much like the darkness that settled over the library as I stared at the financial audit Harrison had messengered over in a nondescript briefcase. I sat in the high-backed velvet chair that had belonged to my father, the smell of aged paper and sea salt swirling around me, but all I could taste was the metallic tang of old blood. The wind from the Atlantic battered the window panes of the Hamptons estate, a restless, angry sound that matched the rhythm of my thoughts. Julian was in Malibu now. I could almost see him, standing on that glass-walled deck, breathing in the Pacific air, thinking he had finally ascended to the throne he had spent 10 years carving out of my ribs. He probably thought I was still in the penthouse, weeping into the silk pillows he had bought me with my own money. He didn't realize that every second of his freedom was a loan I was about to call in. I flipped the page of the report, my eyes blurring as I saw the figures. $4,200,000. It wasn't just a lump sum. It was a systematic harvest. 100,000 here for a consulting fee to a shell company in Delaware. 50,000 there for architectural sourcing in Italy. He had been bleeding me dry, cent by cent, month by month, for nearly 3 years. Every time he had looked me in the eyes and told me he was working late to secure our legacy, he was actually forging the keys to his own kingdom. And then I saw her name, buried in a list of payroll expenses for a defunct design firm, Elena Vance. My mind drifted back to 3 years ago, to the day Eleanor walked into our lives. I remember the way the sun hit her blonde hair in the lobby of Thorne and Vanderbilt. She looked so young, so painfully earnest in her cheap blazer and scuffed heels. I had been the one to hire her. I remember Julian standing by the window of his office, his back to us, as I interviewed her. I liked her spirit. I liked the way she spoke about architecture as if it were a religion. I thought I was being a mentor. I thought I was giving a bright young woman the break I never had to work for because of my name. "She's a quick learner, Julian," I had told him that night as we lay in bed. He had barely looked up from his iPad, his voice a low, disinterested hum. "If you think so, Victoria, I trust your judgment." The memory burned like lye. I had invited a viper into my garden and handed her the sun. I remembered the small things now, the details that I had dismissed as professional camaraderie. The way Eleanor would bring him his specific blend of coffee without him asking. The way she would stay late to organize his blueprints, and how Julian's mood would always be lighter when he finally came home. I remembered a dinner party we hosted for the board members. I had caught Eleanor staring at the Vanderbilt family portrait in our dining room. There was a hunger in her eyes that I had mistaken for ambition. I thought she wanted to be like me. I didn't realize she was planning to replace me. I looked at a photo Harrison had included in the file, a surveillance shot from 6 months ago. It was Julian and Elena in a park in Brooklyn, far from the prying eyes of the Upper East Side. He was holding her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles in a way he hadn't done to me in years. They looked like a couple in a jewelry commercial. And then there was the child, baby Leo. The realization hit me again, a fresh wave of nausea that made the room spin. While I was lying on cold exam tables, my legs in stirrups, praying for a miracle that never came, Julian was already a father. He had held a baby that wasn't mine while I was still mourning the ghost of the one we lost. He had looked at Eleanor with the pride I had been dying to see in his eyes for a decade. Every hormone shot, every tear I shed over a negative pregnancy test, every silent car ride home from the clinic, he was just waiting for it to be over so he could go back to his real family. The audit showed that Julian had used the Vanderbilt Trust to pay for Eleanor's medical bills. The Azure Shell wasn't just a house. It was a reward for giving him the son I couldn't. I looked at the floor plans of the Malibu house. It was a masterpiece, but it was a theft. He had used my father's signature style, the sweeping cantilevers, the hidden courtyards, the way the light interacted with the stone. He had stolen my family's aesthetic to build a tomb for my marriage. It was the ultimate humiliation. He wasn't just a cheat. He was a plagiarist of my soul. I reached for the phone on the desk, my fingers trembling as I dialed Julian's number. I didn't intend to speak. I just wanted to hear the sound of his world. It rang 3 times before he picked up. The background noise was unmistakable, the sound of waves and the distant cry of a seagull. "Hello?" he said, his voice relaxed, buoyant. It was the voice of a man who believed the ocean belonged to him. I heard a woman's laugh in the distance, a high, musical sound that I recognized as Eleanor's, and then a small, sharp cry, a baby's cry. I held my breath, the silence in the Hamptons library feeling like a shroud. Julian sighed, a sound of pure contentment. "Eleanor, honey, can you check on Leo? I think he's waking up." I closed my eyes, the image of them in that sun-drenched house searing into my retinas. He didn't even check the caller ID. He was so arrogant, so convinced of his own brilliance, that he didn't think I would ever find him. I hung up the phone without a word. My heart wasn't breaking anymore. It was crystallizing. I called Harrison back. "I heard him," I said, my voice as cold as the Atlantic outside. "He's there, with her, and the child." "I know, Victoria," Harrison said, his voice steady. "We've tracked the wire transfers to a local contractor in Malibu. He's been spending heavily on the nursery. Hand-painted murals, Italian furniture. He's nesting with your money." "I want it gone, Harrison. All of it." I stood up and walked to the window, watching the moonlight dance on the black water of the bay. "I want the Azure Shell put into escrow immediately. I want the holding company investigated for fraud. And Julian, I want him to find out that his credit cards are useless the next time he tries to buy a bottle of champagne to celebrate his new life. I want him to feel the walls closing in, exactly like I felt when I was trapped in that fertility clinic." "It's already in motion," Harrison replied. "The Vanderbilt accounts are being walled off as we speak. By tomorrow morning, Julian Thorne will be a man with a $5 million house he can't enter and a bank balance of 0. But Victoria, you need to be prepared. He will fight. He will try to use the marriage contract against you." "The marriage contract was built on the assumption of a marriage," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "What we had wasn't a marriage. It was a long-term embezzlement scheme. He didn't love me, Harrison. He loved the bank vault I was attached to. If he wants to fight, tell him I'll see him in court. But remind him that I'm a Vanderbilt. We don't just win, we erase." I hung up and walked out onto the balcony. The night air was freezing, the salt spray stinging my cheeks. I thought about Eleanor Vance. I thought about the girl I had mentored, the one I had shared my lunches with, the one I had trusted with my schedules and my secrets. How many times had she stood in my kitchen and smiled at me while knowing she was carrying my husband's child? How many times had she watched me cry over a failed IVF cycle and offered me a tissue, all the while thinking of the nursery Julian was building for her in California? The depth of the betrayal was a physical weight, a cold stone in the center of my chest. They hadn't just stolen my money, they had stolen my time. 10 years of my life, gone. But as I stood there, looking out at the vastness of the ocean, the weight began to shift. The enhuknya, the shame of being the fool, started to burn away, leaving something harder and more dangerous in its place. I wasn't the victim of this story. I was the architect of its ending. Julian thought he was the one who designed beautiful things, but he had forgotten who provided the land and the foundation. I went back inside and sat at the desk. I opened a fresh document on my laptop. No more tears, no more what-ifs. I began to draft the press release that would be sent to every architectural firm in the country. Julian Thorne wasn't just going to be poor, he was going to be a pariah. I would make sure his name was synonymous with betrayal and theft. I spent the rest of the night working, the glow of the screen the only light in the massive house. I felt like a general preparing for a siege. Every transaction I traced, every lie I uncovered, was another brick in the wall I was building around him. I found a secret account he had opened for Eleanor's personal expenses. He had been buying her jewelry, Cartier, Tiffany, pieces that were more expensive than anything he had ever bought for me. I looked at the receipts and laughed. It was a hollow, jagged sound that echoed through the empty library. He was so predictable. He was playing the role of the provider, the big man, using my family's wealth to impress a girl half his age. By 4 a.m., the first phase of the counterstrike was complete. Harrison had confirmed that the Malibu property was now under a legal cloud that would take years to resolve. Julian would wake up tomorrow in a house that wasn't legally his, in a life he couldn't afford, with a woman who had only loved him for the shadow he cast, a shadow that was actually mine. I shut my laptop and walked to the window. The sky was beginning to turn a pale, bruised purple. The first light of dawn was hitting the waves. I thought about the child again. Leo. I wondered what kind of man he would grow up to be, raised in the wreckage of his father's ego. I felt a momentary pang of sorrow for the boy, caught in the crossfire of a war he didn't ask for. But then I remembered the photos of Julian holding him, the way he looked at the boy with a love he had never shown me. That love was built on a foundation of theft. It was a beautiful lie, and it had to be dismantled. I walked to the kitchen and made myself a cup of black coffee, not the Blue Mountain blend Julian liked, but a strong, bitter roast that felt honest. I stood in the same spot where my father had stood every morning for 50 years, looking out at the Vanderbilt estate. He had told me once that the only thing more dangerous than a man with everything to lose is a woman who has already lost everything and realized she's still standing. I was still standing. The pain was there, a ghost in the corners of my mind, but it was no longer in control. I was the silent architect. I was the one who owned the land. And as the sun finally broke over the horizon, casting a long, golden path across the water, I knew that the storm Julian had started was finally coming home to Malibu. The journey through the wreckage of a shattered heart is a solitary one, marked by the realization that the people we love most are often the ones we know the least. In the wake of such a profound betrayal, it is easy to succumb to the darkness of despair, but it is in these very depths that we find the steel within our souls. I had to learn that my worth was never tied to his loyalty, and that the legacy of my family was a shield, not a burden. Healing is not the absence of the scar, but the strength to carry it as a badge of survival, finding light in the quiet resolution to reclaim my own story and emerge from the trauma not just restored, but transformed. The silence I sent across the continent was not an absence of sound, but a presence of weight. It was a cold, suffocating blanket draped over the sun-drenched shores of Malibu from the grey, rain-lashed cliffs of the Hamptons. I sat in the dark of the estate library, the only light coming from the amber glow of the fireplace and the flickering blue of my laptop screen. Harrison had been sending me real-time updates through a secure channel. I wasn't just watching a marriage end, I was watching a biological organism being deprived of oxygen. Julian was the organism, and my wealth was the air he had forgotten he didn't own. I imagined him waking up in that glass house, the azure shell, feeling the first true chill of the abyss I had opened beneath his feet. He would have walked to the espresso machine, the one I knew cost $6,000, and waited for the caffeine to jumpstart his day of beautiful lies. He had no idea that, while he slept, the digital walls of his fortress had been replaced with ice. The first crack in his world appeared at 10 in the morning, Pacific time. Harrison had a team on the ground, shadows moving in the bright California sun. Julian had taken Elena to a high-end nursery boutique in Santa Monica. I could see it perfectly. The whitewashed wood, the scent of lavender and expensive cotton, the soft music designed to make expectant parents feel like their love was the only currency that mattered. He had picked out a hand-carved mahogany crib, a piece that was more a sculpture than furniture. He had smiled at the saleswoman, that practiced architect's smile that promised stability and vision. He had reached into his alligator skin wallet and pulled out the black Centurion card, the one linked to the Vanderbilt primary account, the one that was his umbilical cord to my life. The decline was immediate. The saleswoman, polite and polished, had tried it again and again. I could feel Julian's confusion through the cold data on my screen. He would have laughed it off, made a joke about New York banks and their oversensitive fraud alerts. He would have pulled out a second card, then a third. One by one, the plastic became useless shards in his hand. The Vanderbilt Trust didn't just freeze his accounts, it erased his existence from the financial grid. Harrison had timed it with a surgical cruelty I found myself admiring. Julian Thorne, the man who designed skyscrapers, couldn't even buy a blanket for the sun he had hidden from me. I leaned back in my chair, the salt spray from the Atlantic hitting the glass behind me, and felt a jagged spark of satisfaction. It wasn't joy, it was the cold comfort of physics. For every action, an equal and opposite reaction. Then came the calls. My phone sat on the mahogany desk, vibrating with a desperate rhythmic intensity. Julian Thorne. The name flashed on the screen over and over, a digital ghost begging for re-entry. I didn't answer. I didn't even silence it. I let it vibrate until the room seemed to hum with his panic. I wanted him to feel the silence. I wanted him to understand that the woman who had spent a decade fixing his mistakes, smoothing over his tantrums, and funding his dreams, was no longer there. I was the silent architect now. Every missed call was another brick in the tomb I was building for his ego. He would have called the office next, looking for his secretary, looking for a way to reset the world. But he didn't get his secretary. He got Harrison Sterling. I could almost hear Harrison's voice over the wire, smooth, professional, and utterly devoid of mercy. He would have informed Julian that his position at Thorne and Vanderbilt had been suspended pending an internal audit into certain irregularities. He would have mentioned the Delaware shell companies. He would have mentioned the siphoned millions. And then He would have delivered the final blow. The Malibu house, the azure shell, was now under a legal freeze. Julian was a trespasser in a masterpiece he had stolen from my family's soul. I wondered what Eleanor was doing in that moment. Was she still holding the cashmere blanket? Was she looking at the man she thought was a king and seeing, for the first time, the hollow shell underneath? She had traded her youth for a shadow, and I was the one who had just turned off the light. The reports from the private investigators were clinical. Julian had returned to the Malibu house in a state of visible agitation. He was pacing the deck, the glass walls he loved so much, now reflecting nothing but his own ruin. He was shouting into his phone, his face a bruised purple against the perfect blue of the Pacific. Elena was inside, her silhouette visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, her hands protective over her stomach. They were trapped in paradise. The cars in the driveway, the vintage Porsche, the Range Rover, were no longer theirs to drive. The staff had been instructed to leave. The power, the water, the security, everything was tied to accounts that no longer recognized Julian's signature. He was standing in a $5 million prison, surrounded by the beauty he had plagiarized from my life, and he was realizing that beauty has no value when you can't pay for the air inside it. I stood up and walked to the library window, looking out at the Hamptons fog. The physical distance between us was 3,000 miles, but the psychological distance was an infinite abyss. I thought about the years of gaslighting. How many times had he made me feel like I was the one who was failing? How many times had he looked at my tears over another failed IVF cycle and sighed, a sound of weary patience that made me feel like a broken machine? "It's okay, Victoria," he would say, his hand on my shoulder, feeling like a lead weight. "We have each other. That should be enough." But it was never enough for him. He was just waiting for me to break so he could replace me with a version that functioned the way he wanted. He didn't want a wife. He wanted a legacy, and he wanted me to pay for the privilege of being discarded. The enhuknya, the shame, was a cold, heavy stone in my gut. I remembered Eleanor sitting in my kitchen, taking notes on our social calendar, her eyes wide with what I thought was admiration. I had given her my old designer handbags. I had given her a bonus when her mother was sick. I had treated her like a sister, or perhaps the daughter I couldn't have. And all the while, she was carrying my husband's child, looking at my home and my life as a set of blueprints she could simply move into. She had seen my vulnerability as an opportunity. They had sat at my table, breathed my air, and plotted my obsolescence. The depth of that betrayal was a dark, bottomless well. I realized then that I hadn't just been blind, I had been too kind. I had been a Vanderbilt trying to be a person, while they were predators who only understood the language of the hunt. I looked at the clock. It was nearly midnight in New York, 3 hours earlier in California. The process servers would be arriving at the Azure Shell any moment now. Harrison had filed an emergency injunction. Julian wouldn't be arrested yet. Not for the embezzlement, not yet. But he would be evicted. The house was an asset of the Vanderbilt Trust, and the trust was no longer authorizing his residency. I sat back down at the desk and opened a bottle of my father's 25-year-old scotch. The liquid was dark gold, smelling of peat and thyme. I poured a glass and toasted the darkness. Julian had wanted a life of luxury and secret families. I was going to give him a life of legal documents and public disgrace. I was going to make sure that every time he looked at his son, he remembered that the boy's father was a thief who lost everything to the woman he thought he could outsmart. The phone vibrated again. This time I picked it up. I didn't say hello. I didn't say anything. I just listened to his breathing on the other end. It was ragged, panicked, the sound of a man who was drowning in plain sight. Victoria, he whispered, his voice cracking. Victoria, please. I don't know what's happening. The cards, the accounts, even the house. There are men here, Victoria. They're telling me I have to leave. Please, tell them it's a mistake. Tell them who I am. I took a slow sip of the scotch, the burn of it a welcome sensation in the frozen wasteland of my chest. I know exactly who you are, Julian, I said, my voice as calm as a cemetery at night. You're a tenant whose lease has expired. You're an architect who forgot to own the land he built on. And you're a man who thinks $5 million of my father's money could buy him a soul. Victoria, listen to me, he started, his voice rising in a desperate pitch. Eleanor, she's pregnant. The baby. He needs a home. You can't do this to a child. You're not that person. You loved me. I loved a ghost, Julian. I loved a facade that I paid to maintain. And as for the child, I paused, thinking of the little boy named Leo, the miracle I had been denied while you were thriving on my misery. He will have a home. It just won't be one that I paid for. If you love him so much, Julian, find a way to provide for him without using my grandfather's name. Go build something that isn't a theft. Go be a man who doesn't need a Vanderbilt to tell him he exists. You're a monster, he spat, the charm finally falling away to reveal the venom underneath. You're a cold, barren bitch who thinks money can fix the fact that nobody wants to stay with you. You're a Vanderbilt. You're just a bank account with a pulse. I laughed, a soft, chilling sound that seemed to surprise even me. I am a bank account, Julian, and I just closed your account. Goodbye, Julian. Don't bother calling again. Harrison will handle the rest of your life. I hung up and felt a sudden, profound stillness. The vibration was gone. The noise was gone. There was only the sound of the wind and the crackle of the fire. I had reached the center of the U-curve. I was at the very bottom of the abyss, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was falling. I felt like I had landed on solid rock. I spent the next hour watching the feed from Malibu. The process servers had arrived. I saw the flash of the headlights in the driveway, the men in dark suits carrying the folders that would end Julian's California dream. I saw Julian and Eleanor standing on the deck, surrounded by suitcases that were likely filled with things I had bought them. They looked small. They looked insignificant against the backdrop of the Pacific. The azure shell was still beautiful, but it was no longer a home. It was evidence. It was a monument to a crime that was finally being prosecuted. I turned off the computer and walked to the balcony. The Hamptons' fog had cleared, and the stars were visible now, cold, distant, and permanent. The journey through the wreckage of a shattered heart is a solitary one, marked by the realization that the people we love most are often the ones we know the least. In the wake of such a profound betrayal, it is easy to succumb to the darkness of despair, but it is in these very depths that we find the steel within our souls. I had to learn that my worth was never tied to his loyalty, and that the legacy of my family was a shield, not a burden. Healing is not the absence of the scar, but the strength to carry it as a badge of survival, finding light in the quiet resolution to reclaim my own story and emerge from the trauma not just restored, but transformed. The sun rose over the Hamptons with a clarity that felt like an insult to the complexity of my grief. I stood on the veranda of the Vanderbilt estate, the wind whipping my silk robe around my ankles, watching the tide retreat as if it were embarrassed to be seen. In Malibu, it was still deep night, a darkness filled with the sirens of process servers and the frantic, hushed whispers of a man who had finally realized the ground beneath him was made of paper. Harrison had sent the final report of the eviction an hour ago. Julian and Eleanor were out. They were standing on the PCH, surrounded by the expensive luggage I had bought, holding a child that was the living evidence of my replacement. I should have felt a surge of triumph, a rush of adrenaline that signaled the beginning of the end. But all I felt was a hollow, ringing silence. I was standing in the center of my empire, surrounded by the ghosts of 100 years of power, and yet I felt like a fragile porcelain doll that had been shattered and glued back together by a blind man. I walked back into the library, the air smelling of old leather and the lingering scent of the scotch I had consumed the night before. I sat at my father's desk and stared at the phone. It was quiet now. Julian had stopped calling. He had finally understood that the woman who used to answer his cries for help was dead. He was now dealing with the mechanism of the Vanderbilt Trust, a cold, legal machine that didn't have a heart to break or a pride to wound. I looked at the surveillance photos again, the ones Harrison had sent of the eviction. Julian looked smaller than I had ever seen him. He was wearing a cashmere sweater I had given him for his birthday, his face illuminated by the harsh blue lights of a patrol car. He looked like a stranger. It was a terrifying realization. I had spent a decade of my life loving a silhouette, a man I had projected my own dreams onto until he looked like a god. The ping of a new email broke the silence. It wasn't from Harrison. It was from an address I didn't recognize, a string of random numbers and letters that felt like a whisper from the digital underbelly of the city. The subject line was a single word: plagiarism. My hand hovered over the mouse, a cold shiver racing down my spine. I clicked it. There was no text in the body of the email, only a link to a secure drive and a password. I typed in the characters with trembling fingers, my breath hitching as the files began to load. It was a collection of architectural blueprints, old and weathered, dating back 15 years. They were the original designs for the Thorn Tower, the project that had made Julian's career and cemented our partnership with my father's firm. But the name on the title block wasn't Julian Thorn. It was Alistair Finch. I sat back, the room suddenly feeling very small. Alistair Finch was a name I had heard only once, years ago, in a passing conversation at a gala. Julian had mentioned him as a former classmate who had struggled with substance issues and ultimately dropped out of the industry. But as I scrolled through the files, I saw the truth laid bare in black ink. Every sweeping curve, every innovative use of light, every structural miracle that Julian had been credited for. It was all here, designed by a man who had vanished from the record. Julian hadn't just stolen my money, he had stolen his very identity. He was a fraud in every sense of the word. He was a man who had built a career on the stolen brilliance of a shadow. And he had married me to ensure that no one would ever look too closely at the foundation of his success. My phone rang, a sharp, jarring sound in the stillness. It was a private number. I hesitated, then answered. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice sounding brittle. "A ghost, Victoria," a man's voice replied. It was low, gravelly, the sound of someone who had spent too much time in the cold. A ghost Julian Thorne thought he had buried under $5 million of hush money and a non-disclosure agreement that I finally realized was as worthless as his soul. "Alistair?" I whispered, the name feeling like a curse on my tongue. "I've been watching, Victoria," he said, and I could hear the clinking of a glass on the other end. "I saw the news about the Vanderbilt audit. I saw the whispers about the Malibu house. I figured it was time for the silent partner to speak. Julian isn't just a cheat, Victoria. He's a thief of ideas. He's a parasite who found a host in your family's prestige. I designed the shell, Victoria. Not him. I designed the tower. He just changed the signatures." The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. I gripped the edge of the mahogany desk, the wood biting into my palms. The azure shell, the house I thought was a love letter to Eleanor, was actually another stolen masterpiece. Julian Thorne was a hollow man, a vessel filled with other people's genius and my family's money. I felt a sudden, sharp clarity. The enhuk nya, the shame, that had been suffocating me for days, was suddenly replaced by a cold, clinical focus. I wasn't just a betrayed wife. I was the person holding the evidence that would erase Julian Thorne from the history of architecture. "What do you want, Alistair?" I asked, my voice gaining a steel I didn't know I possessed. "I don't want your money, Victoria," he replied, and I believed him. "I want my name back. I want to see the man who erased me feel what it's like to be invisible. I have the original CAD files. I have the emails. I have the proof that he hasn't drawn a single original line in 10 years. I'm sending you the rest now. Do with it what you will." The line went dead. I stared at the screen as the files continued to pour in, a digital avalanche of ruin. I realized then that this was the fragile support I had been waiting for. It wasn't a savior. It was a weapon. I wasn't going to just take his house and his bank accounts. I was going to take his past. I was going to unmake the man until there was nothing left but the small, hungry creature that had walked into my lobby 15 years ago. I called Harrison. "We have it," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Everything. The blueprints, the fraud, the proof that Julian Thorne is a ghost. I want a press conference prepared for tomorrow. I want the board of the firm to meet at the penthouse. And Harrison, I want you to find Alistair Finch. I want him in New York. I want him to be the one who presents the truth." "Victoria, this is a massive gamble," Harrison warned, though I could hear the excitement in his voice. "This will destroy the firm's reputation as much as his." "The firm belongs to the Vanderbilts, Harrison," I replied, standing up and walking toward the grand staircase. "We built it once. We can build it again. But we cannot build anything on a foundation of lies. I would rather see the Thorne and Vanderbilt name burn to the ground than let it stand as a monument to his theft. Prepare the car. I'm coming back to the city." The drive back to Manhattan was different this time. The grey clouds had parted, and the city skyline loomed ahead like a challenge. I wasn't the broken woman who had fled in the night. I was a sovereign returning to her kingdom. I sat in the back of the car, my fingers flying across my tablet, coordinating with the PR teams, the legal experts, and the silent allies who had been waiting for the wind to change. I felt a strange, detached calm. It was the U-curve in action. I had touched the very bottom of the abyss, the absolute zero of my existence, and I had found that the only way left to go was up. As we crossed the bridge into Manhattan, I saw a billboard for one of Julian's upcoming projects, a luxury hotel in Midtown. His face was there, large and confident, with a tagline about designing the future. I looked at it and laughed. It was a thin, sharp sound that startled the driver. The future he had designed was already a ghost. By this time tomorrow, that billboard would be a mockery. I arrived at the penthouse at sunset. The apartment felt different, larger, colder, but no longer suffocating. I walked through the rooms where he had lied to me, where he had planned my replacement, and I felt nothing. The furniture, the art, the scent of his sandalwood, it was all just decor in a play that had been cancelled. I went to the master suite and looked at the closet filled with his suits. They looked like empty skins. I called the building manager. "Pack everything," I said, my voice echoing in the marble hallway. "Every suit, every watch, every scrap of paper that belongs to Julian Thorne. I want it in storage by midnight, and I want the locks changed. Again." I spent the evening in the study, the same room where I had discovered the first lie. Harrison arrived at 9 p.m. with a man who looked like he hadn't seen the sun in a decade. He was thin, his hair greying prematurely, his eyes sharp but weary. Alistair Finch. He stood in the middle of my father's study and looked around with a bitter smile. "Nice place, Victoria," he said, his voice a low rasp. "I recognize the mouldings. I designed them for a competition in Zurich 12 years ago. Julian told me they were too traditional. I see he changed his mind when he had your father's checkbook." I didn't say anything. I just handed him a glass of scotch. We sat in the silence of the library, two victims of the same predator, and we began to plan the execution. Alistair showed me the files, the meticulous detail of his theft. Julian had been careful, but he had been lazy. He had reused modules, structural formulas, and aesthetic flourishes that were uniquely Alistair's. It was a digital fingerprint that couldn't be denied. "He thought I was dead, Victoria," Alistair said, staring into his glass. "He thought the settlement money would keep me quiet until the alcohol finished me off. He didn't realize that watching him build his empire on my bones was the only thing that kept me sober." "He won't be building anything else, Alistair," I promised. "By this time tomorrow, the architectural world will know exactly who Julian Thorne is, and they will know who you are." We worked through the night, a fragile alliance forged in the fire of shared trauma. I felt a strange sense of kinship with this man. We had both been used as fuel for Julian's ambition. We had both been discarded when we were no longer useful. But together, we were a force that Julian could never have anticipated. He had planned for a legal battle. He had planned for a divorce. He had even planned for my anger. But he hadn't planned for the truth. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the New York skyline, I stood at the window and watched the city wake up. I felt a lightness I hadn't felt in years. The pain was still there, a dull ache in the back of my mind, but it was being slowly replaced by a sense of purpose. I wasn't just surviving the betrayal, I was reclaiming my life. I looked at Alistair, who was asleep in the leather chair, clutching a folder of blueprints like a child with a stuffed animal. He was my secret ally, my fragile support, and he was the one who would help me deliver the final blow. I walked to the kitchen and made coffee. The penthouse was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the city. I thought about Julian and Eleanor in Malibu. Harrison had told me they were staying in a cheap motel near the airport, their belongings in a rental car they couldn't pay for. I wondered if they were looking at each other now and seeing the truth. Without the money, without the prestige, without the stolen brilliance, what were they? They were just two people who had built a house on sand. I looked at my reflection in the polished black granite of the island. I saw a woman I recognized, not the wife, not the victim, but the Vanderbilt. I saw the steel in my eyes and the set of my jaw. I was ready. The board meeting was at 10 a.m. The press conference was at 2 p.m. And Julian Thorne was about to find out that the silent architect had finally finished her masterpiece. It was a design for a reckoning, and it was going to be perfect. The journey through the wreckage of a shattered heart is a solitary one, marked by the realization that the people we love most are often the ones we know the least. In the wake of such a profound betrayal, it is easy to succumb to the darkness of despair, but it is in these very depths that we find the steel within our souls. I had to learn that my worth was never tied to his loyalty, and that the legacy of my family was a shield, not a burden. Healing is not the absence of the scar, but the strength to carry it as a badge of survival, finding light in the quiet resolution to reclaim my own story and emerge from the trauma not just restored, but transformed. The act of self-advocacy is the ultimate reclamation of power. I stood among the ruins and chose to rebuild not just a firm, but a self that could never be stolen again. The air in the penthouse was stale, a stagnant mixture of expensive floor wax and the lingering ghost of a life that had never truly existed. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the grand salon, the New York skyline laid out before me like a glittering, indifferent judge. It was 10 o'clock in the morning, but the sky was a bruised charcoal, heavy with the promise of a storm that refused to break. Behind me, the room was filled with the silent, heavy presence of the Thorne and Vanderbilt board of directors. Men and women I had known my entire life, people who had toasted to my father's health and then to my marriage, now sat in the velvet-upholstered chairs like vultures waiting for the first sign of rot. Harrison Sterling stood by the double oak doors, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression as unyielding as a gargoyle. And in the corner, half hidden by the shadows of the library entrance, sat Alistair Finch. He was the ghost I had brought back to haunt the man who thought he had reached the summit. I heard the elevator chime, a sharp, musical sound that felt like a needle to my brain. The doors slid open, and Julian Thorne stepped into the foyer. He wasn't the man who had left for Seattle a week ago. The navy suit was wrinkled, his hair was a mess of unkempt waves, and his eyes were bloodshot, darting around the room with the frantic energy of a trapped animal. He looked at me, and for a split second, I saw the old Julian, the one who thought he could smile his way out of a hurricane. He started toward me, his hands reaching out, his voice a practiced tremor of desperation. "Victoria, thank God. I don't know what Harrison told you, but it's all a misunderstanding. I was mugged in California. The accounts were compromised." He stopped mid-sentence as his eyes adjusted to the light, and he saw the board members. He saw the cold, stony faces of the people who funded his existence. And then he saw Alistair. Julian's face didn't just pale. It seemed to hollow out, the skin tightening over his cheekbones until he looked like a skeletal version of himself. The silence in the room became an entity, a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed the breath from his lungs. I stood perfectly still, my hands resting on the back of my father's chair, feeling the immense power of my own stillness. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't throw the evidence in his face. I simply looked at him, seeing through the layers of tailored wool and practiced charisma to the small, hollow creature underneath. "Sit down, Julian," I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from a great distance, thin and sharp as a razor. "We have a lot to discuss about the future you've been designing." He didn't move. He stayed frozen in the center of the foyer, looking at Alistair Finch as if he were seeing a literal demon. Alistair stood up slowly, the blueprints, the original weathered vellum of the Thorne Tower, clutched in his hand. He walked into the center of the room and laid them out on the mahogany table. "Recognize these, Julian?" Alistair asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "I found them in the digital archives you forgot to purge, or maybe you just didn't think I'd ever be sober enough to remember where the keys were kept." Julian's facade didn't crack. It disintegrated. He turned back to me, his voice a frantic hiss. "Victoria, he's a drunk. He's a failed architect looking for a payday. You can't believe this." "I believe the numbers, Julian," I interrupted, the ice in my chest finally beginning to spread to my fingertips. "I believe the $4 million you siphoned from my trust to buy a villa in Malibu for my assistant. I believe the wire transfers to the medical clinic where Elena Vance gave birth to a son you named Leo. And I believe the CAD files that show you haven't had an original thought since the day you met me." The room erupted into a low murmur of disgust. The board members, men who valued legacy above all else, looked at Julian like he was a stain on the marble floor. I watched him try to find a foothold, a lie that would stick, but the ground was already gone. He turned to Harrison, his eyes wide with a terrifying, pathetic hope. Harrison, you've known me for a decade. Tell them, tell them I'm the talent. Tell them the firm needs me. Harrison didn't even look up from his notepad. The firm needs an architect, Mr. Thorne, not a plagiarist. The audit is complete. Every project you've claimed as your own for the last 5 years is being reviewed. The Delaware shell companies have been seized. You are no longer an employee of this firm, nor are you a resident of this building. Your belongings are in a storage unit in New Jersey. The key is with the concierge. Julian staggered back, his hand catching the edge of a console table. He looked at me, his eyes filling with a sudden, ugly rage. "You did this!" he spat, the mask finally falling away to reveal the monster I had been married to. "You couldn't give me a son, so you decided to destroy the one I had. You're a cold, barren Vanderbilt who thinks she can buy people's souls. You think you've won? Eleanor is waiting for me. We have a life you can't even imagine. We have a love that doesn't come with a price tag." I laughed then, a hollow, jagged sound that seemed to shock the room into a deeper silence. "Eleanor isn't waiting for you, Julian," I said, pulling a single sheet of paper from the desk. "She called Harrison this morning. The moment the accounts were frozen, the moment the Azure shell was boarded up and the private security detail was withdrawn, she realized that love doesn't pay for diapers in a cheap motel. She's gone, Julian. She took the car, the jewelry you bought her with my money, and she's already halfway to her mother's house in Ohio. She didn't leave a note. She only left a message for Harrison. Tell Victoria I'm sorry. I just wanted a life. It seems your real family was just as transactional as you were." The silence that followed was absolute. Julian looked like he had been struck. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at the blueprints on the table, then at the board, then at me. He was a man with no past, no present, and a future that was a dark, empty room. He was a ghost in his own penthouse. I realized then that the purging was complete. I had stripped away the money, the career, the mistress, and the stolen genius. I had unmade the man until there was nothing left but the truth. "Get out, Julian," I said, the words feeling like a benediction. "Before I decide to call the district attorney about the embezzlement charges. Harrison is prepared to file them by noon if you're still within the city limits. Go find Alistair's shadow. Go see if you can build a life on the nothing you actually are." He didn't say another word. He turned and walked toward the elevator, his shoulders slumped, his steps heavy and rhythmic, the sound of a man walking toward his own execution. The doors slid shut behind him, and the penthouse felt suddenly lighter, as if a poison had finally been sucked out of the air. The board members stood up, offering their hollow condolences and their promises of rebranding, but I didn't hear them. I just looked at Alistair Finch, who was staring at his blueprints with a look of profound, quiet sorrow. "You have your name back, Alistair," I said softly. "It feels lighter than I remembered, Victoria," he replied, standing up and handing me the folder. "But a name is just a word. He took the years. He took the dreams. You can't get those back from a bank." I walked to the window and watched the rain finally begin to fall. It was a torrential downpour, washing the soot and the secrets from the New York streets. I thought about the U-curve. I had hit the absolute bottom. I had faced the man who destroyed my faith, and I had dismantled him piece by piece. I didn't feel the rush of victory I had expected. I just felt a deep, exhausted peace. The reckoning wasn't just about Julian's ruin, it was about my own liberation. I had purged the lie from my life, and for the first time in 10 years, I could breathe without feeling like I was inhaling glass. I spent the rest of the day in the penthouse, watching the staff pack the last of his things. I found a small box in the back of his closet, photos of us from our honeymoon in Italy. We were standing on a cliff in Positano, the sun hitting his face, his arm around me. He looked so real. I stared at the photo for a long time, trying to find the lie in his eyes, but it was perfect. He was a masterpiece of deception. I took the photo and walked to the fireplace. I dropped it into the embers and watched the paper curl and blacken, the image of our happiness turning to grey ash. It was a funeral for a ghost. By evening, the apartment was empty of him. The sandalwood scent was gone, replaced by the clean, sharp smell of rain and ozone. Harrison called to confirm that Julian had been seen boarding a bus at Port Authority, heading toward a world where the name Thorn meant nothing. He was gone. The villa by the sea was a legal ghost. The child was a legacy in a different state. And I was Victoria Vanderbilt, sitting in the ruins of a 10-year war, finally realizing that the only architect I ever needed was the one who survived inside of me. I walked to the grand piano and played a single note. It echoed through the cavernous room, clear and pure. It was a start. I wasn't restored yet. The scars were deep, and the hollow in my heart where a child should have been was still there. Nhung toi da tu do. I had faced the darkness, and I hadn't blinked. Part 5 of my life was over. The purging was complete. And as the city lights began to flicker on through the rain, I knew that the design for my rebirth was already being drawn. The journey through the wreckage of a shattered heart is a solitary one, marked by the realization that the people we love most are often the ones we know the least. In the wake of such a profound betrayal, it is easy to succumb to the darkness of despair, but it is in these very depths that we find the steel within our souls. I had to learn that my worth was never tied to his loyalty, and that the legacy of my family was a shield, not a burden. Healing is not the absence of the scar, but the strength to carry it as a badge of survival, finding light in the quiet resolution to reclaim my own story and emerge from the trauma not just restored, but transformed. True recovery is about reclaiming your narrative, finding joy and purpose in unexpected new beginnings, and realizing that your life is defined by the quality of the relationships you choose to cultivate, rather than the ones that abandoned you.